Welcome to Classics You Slept Through's presentation of Wieland, or The Transformation, an American Tale by Charles Brockton Brown. Advertisement. The following work is delivered to the world as the first of a series of performances, which the favorable reception of this will induce the writer to publish. His purpose is neither selfish nor temporary, but aims at the illustration of some important branches of the moral constitution of man. Whether this tale will be classed with the ordinary or frivolous sources of amusement, or be ranked with the few productions whose usefulness secures them to a lasting reputation, the reader must be permitted to decide. The incidents related are extraordinary and rare. Some of them, perhaps, approach as nearly to the nature of miracles as can be done by that which is not truly miraculous. It is hoped that intelligent readers will not disapprove of the manner in which the appearances are solved, but that the solution will be found to correspond with the known principles of human nature. The power which the principal person is said to possess can scarcely be denied to be real. It must be acknowledged to be extremely rare. But no fact, equally uncommon, is supported by the same strength of historical evidence. Some readers may think the conduct of the younger Wieland impossible. In support of its possibilities, the writer must appeal to physicians and to men conversant with the latent springs and occasional perversions of the human mind. It will not be objected that the instances of similar delusion are rare, because it is the business of moral painters to exhibit their subject in its most instructive and memorable forms. If history furnishes one parallel fact, it is a sufficient vindication of the writer. But most readers will probably recollect an authentic case, remarkably similar to that of Wieland. It will be necessary to add that this narrative is addressed, in an epistolary form, by the lady whose story it contains, to a small number of friends whose curiosity, with regard to it, had been greatly awakened. It may likewise be mentioned that these events took place between the conclusion of the French and the beginning of the Revolutionary War. The memoirs of Carwin, alluded to at the conclusion of the work, will be published or suppressed according to the reception which is given to the present attempt. Charles Brockton Brown, September 3rd, 1798. Chapter 1. I feel little reluctance in complying with your request. You know not fully the cause of my sorrows. You are a stranger to the depth of my distress. Hence, your efforts at consolation must necessarily fail. Yet the tale I am going to tell is not intended as a claim upon your sympathy. In the midst of my despair, I do not disdain to contribute what little I can to the benefit of mankind. I acknowledge your right to be informed of the events that have lately happened in my family. Make what use of the tale you think shall be proper. If it be communicated to the world, it will inculcate the duty of avoiding deceit. It will exemplify the force of early impressions, and show the immeasurable evils that flow from an erroneous or imperfect discipline. My state is not destitute of tranquillity. The sentiment that dictates my feelings is not hope. Futurity has no power over my thoughts. To all that is to come, I am perfectly indifferent. With regard to myself, I have nothing more to fear. Fate has done its worst. Henceforth, I am callous to misfortune. I address no supplication to the deity. The power that governs the course of human affairs has chosen his path. The decree that ascertained the condition of my life admits of no recall. No doubt it squares with the maxims of eternal equity. That is neither to be questioned nor denied by me. It suffices that the past is exempt from mutation. The storm that tore up our happiness, and changed into dreariness and desert the blooming scene of our existence, is lulled into grim repose, but not until the victim was transfixed and mangled, till every obstacle was dissipated by its rage, till every remnant of good was wrested from our grasp and exterminated. How will your wonder and that of your companions be excited by my story? Every sentiment will yield to your amazement. If my testimony were without corroborations, you would reject it as incredible. The experience of no human being can furnish a parallel. That I, beyond the rest of mankind, should be reserved for a destiny without alleviation and without example. Listen to my narrative, and then say what it is that has made me deserve to be placed on this dreadful eminence, if, indeed, every faculty be not suspended in wonder that I am still alive, and am able to relate it. My father's ancestry was noble on the paternal side, but his mother was the daughter of a merchant. My grandfather was a younger brother and native of Saxony. He was placed, when he had reached the suitable age, at a German college. During the vacations, he employed himself in traversing the neighboring territory. On one occasion, it was his fortune to visit Hamburg. He formed an acquaintance with Leonard Weiss, a merchant of that city, and was a frequent guest at his house. The merchant had an only daughter, for whom his guest speedily contracted an affection, and in spite of parental menaces and prohibitions, he, in due season, became her husband. By this act, he mortally offended his relations. Thenceforward, he was entirely disowned and rejected by them. They refused to contribute anything to his support. All intercourse ceased, and received from them merely that treatment to which an absolute stranger or a detested enemy would be entitled. He found an asylum in the house of his new father, whose temper was kind, and whose pride was flattered by this alliance. The nobility of his birth was put in the balance against his poverty. Weiss conceived himself, on the whole, to have acted with the highest discretion in thus disposing of his child. My grandfather found it incumbent on him to search out some mode of independent subsistence. His youth had been eagerly devoted to literature and music. These had hitherto been cultivated merely as sources of amusement. They were now converted into the means of gain. At this period, there were few works of taste in the Saxon dialect. My ancestor may be considered as the founder of the German theatre. The modern poet of the same name is sprung from the same family, and perhaps surpasses but little in the fruitfulness of his invention, or the soundness of his taste, the elder Wieland. His life was spent in the composition of sonatas and dramatic pieces. They were not unpopular, but merely afforded him a scanty subsistence. He died in the bloom of his life, and was quickly followed to the grave by his wife. Their only child was taken under the protection of a merchant. At an early age, he was apprenticed to a London trader, and passed 7 years of mercantile servitude. My father was not fortunate in the character of him under whose care he was now placed. He was treated with rigor, and full employment was provided for every hour of his time. His duties were laborious and mechanical. He had been educated with a view to this profession, and therefore was not tormented with unsatisfied desires. He did not hold his present occupations in abhorrence, because they withheld from him paths more flowery and more smooth, but he found in his unintermitted labor, and in the sternness of his master, sufficient occasions for discontent. No opportunities of recreation were allowed him. He spent all his time pent up in a gloomy apartment, or traversing narrow and crowded streets. His food was coarse, and his lodging humble. His heart gradually contracted a habit of morose and gloomy reflection. He could not accurately define what was wanting to his happiness. He was not tortured by comparisons drawn between his own situation and that of others. His state was such as suited his age and his views as to fortune. He did not imagine himself treated with extraordinary or unjustifiable rigor. In this respect, he supposed the condition of others, bound like himself to mercantile service, to resemble his own. Yet every engagement was irksome, and every hour tedious in its lapse. In this state of mind, he chanced to light upon a book written by one of the teachers of the Albigenses, or French Protestants. He entertained no relish for books, and was wholly unconscious of any power they possessed to delight or instruct. This volume had lain for years in a corner of his garret, half buried in dust and rubbish. He had marked it as it lay, had thrown it, as his occasions required, from one spot to another, but had felt no inclination to examine its contents, or even to inquire what was the subject of which it treated. One Sunday afternoon, being induced to retire for a few minutes to his garret, his eye was attracted by a page of this book, which, by some accident, had been opened and placed full in his view. He was seated on the edge of his bed, and was employed in repairing a rent in some part of his clothes. His eyes were not confined to his work, but occasionally wandering, lighted at length upon the page. The words, "Seek, and ye shall find," were those that first offered themselves to his notice. His curiosity was roused by these, so far as to prompt him to proceed. As soon as he finished his work, he took up the book and turned to the first page. The further he read, the more inducement he found to continue, and he regretted the decline of the light which obliged him for the present to close it. The book contained an exposition of the doctrine of the sect of Camisards, and an historical account of its origin. His mind was in a state peculiarly fitted for the reception of devotional sentiments. The craving which had haunted him was now supplied with an object. His mind was at no loss for the theme of meditation. On days of business, he rose at the dawn and retired to his chamber not till late at night. He now supplied himself with candles, and employed his nocturnal and Sunday hours in studying this book. It of course abounded with allusions to the Bible. All its conclusions were deduced from the sacred text. This was the fountain, beyond which it was unnecessary to trace the stream of religious truth, but it was his duty to trace it thus far. A Bible was easily procured, and he ardently entered on the study of it. His understanding had received a particular direction. All his reveries were fashioned in the same mold. His progress towards the formation of his creed was rapid. Every fact and sentiment in this book were viewed through a medium which the writings of the Camisard apostle had suggested. His constructions of the text were hasty, and formed on a narrow scale. Everything was viewed in a disconnected position. One action and one precept were not employed to illustrate and restrict the meaning of another. Hence arose 1,000 scruples, which he had hitherto been a stranger. He was alternately agitated by fear and by ecstasy. He imagined himself beset by the snares of a spiritual foe, and that his security lay in ceaseless watchfulness and prayer. His morals, which had never been loose, were now modeled by a stricter standard. The empire of religious duty extended itself to his looks, gestures, and phrases. All levities of speech and negligences of behavior were prescribed. His air was mournful and contemplative. He labored to keep alive a sentiment of fear and a belief of the awe-creating presence of the deity. Ideas foreign to this were sedulously excluded. To suffer their intrusion was a crime against the divine majesty, inexpiable but by days and weeks of the keenest agonies. No material variation had occurred in a lapse of 2 years. Every day confirmed him in his present modes of thinking and acting. It was to be expected that the tide of his emotions would sometimes recede, that intervals of despondency and doubt would occur, but these gradually were more rare and of shorter duration, and he at last arrived at a state considerably uniform in this respect. His apprenticeship was now almost expired. On his arrival of age, he became entitled, by the will of my grandfather, to a small sum. This sum would hardly suffice to set him afloat as a trader in his present situation, and he had nothing to expect from the generosity of his master. Residence in England had, besides, become almost impossible on account of his religious tenets. In addition to these motives for seeking a new habitation, there was another of the most imperious and irresistible necessity. He had imbibed an opinion that it was his duty to disseminate the truths of the gospel among the unbelieving nations. He was terrified at first by the perils and hardships to which the life of a missionary is exposed. This cowardice made him diligent in the invention of objections and excuses, but he found it impossible wholly to shake off the belief that such was the injunction of his duty. The belief, after every new conflict with his passions, acquired new strength, and at length he formed a resolution of complying with what he deemed the will of heaven. The North American Indians naturally presented themselves as the first objects for this species of benevolence. As soon as his servitude expired, he converted his little fortune into money and embarked for Philadelphia. Here his fears were revived, and a nearer survey of savage manners once more shook his resolution. For a while he relinquished his purpose, and purchasing a farm on the Schuylkill, within a few miles of the city, sat himself down to the cultivation of it. The cheapness of the land, and the service of African slaves, which were then in general use, gave him who was poor in Europe all the advantages of wealth. He passed 14 years in a thrifty and laborious manner. In this time, new objects, new employments, and new associates appeared to have nearly obliterated the devout impressions of his youth. He now became acquainted with a woman of a meek and quiet disposition, and of slender acquirements like himself. He proffered his hand, and was accepted. His previous industry had now enabled him to dispense with personal labor and direct attention to his own concerns. He enjoyed leisure, and was visited afresh by devotional contemplation. The reading of the Scriptures and other religious books became once more his favorite enjoyment. His ancient belief relative to the conversion of the savage tribes was revived with uncommon energy. To the former obstacles were now added the pleadings of parental and conjugal love. The struggle was long and vehement, but his sense of duty would not be stifled or enfeebled, and finally triumphed over every impediment. His efforts were attended with no permanent success. His exhortations had sometimes a temporary power, but more frequently were repelled with insult and derision. In pursuit of this object, he encountered the most eminent perils, and underwent incredible fatigues, hunger, sickness, and solitude. The license of savage passion, and the artifices of his depraved countrymen, all opposed themselves to his progress. His courage did not forsake him till there appeared no reasonable ground to hope for success. He desisted not till his heart was relieved from the supposed obligation to persevere. With his constitution somewhat decayed, he at length returned to his family. An interval of tranquillity succeeded. He was frugal, regular, and strict in the performance of domestic duties. He allied himself with no sect, because he perfectly agreed with none. Social worship is that by which they are all distinguished, but this article found no place in his creed. He rigidly interpreted that precept which enjoins us, when we worship, to retire into solitude, and shut out every species of society. According to him, devotion was not only a silent office, but must be performed alone. An hour at noon and an hour at midnight were thus appropriated. At the distance of 300 yards from his house, on the top of a rock whose sides were steep, rugged, and encumbered with dwarf cedars and stony asperites, he built what to a common eye would have seemed a summer house. The eastern verge of this precipice was 60 feet above the river which flowed at its foot. The view before it consisted of a transparent current, fluctuating and rippling in a rocky channel, and bounded by a rising scene of cornfields and orchards. The edifice was slight and airy. It was no more than a circular area, 12 feet in diameter, whose flooring was the rock, cleared of moss and shrubs, and exactly leveled, edged by 12 Tuscan columns, and covered by an undulating dome. My father furnished the dimensions and outlines, but allowed the artist whom he employed to complete the structure on his own plan. It was without seat, table, or ornament of any kind. This was the temple of his deity. Twice in 24 hours he repaired hither, unaccompanied by any human being. Nothing but physical inability to move was allowed to obstruct or postpone this visit. He did not exact from his family compliance with his example. Few men, equally sincere in their faith, were as sparing in their censures and restrictions with respect to the conduct of others as my father. The character of my mother was no less devout, but her education had habituated her to a different mode of worship. The loneliness of their dwelling prevented her from joining any established congregation, but she was punctual in the offices of prayer and in the performance of hymns to her Savior, after the manner of the disciples of Zinzendorf. My father refused to interfere with her arrangements. His own system was embraced not, accurately speaking, because it was the best, but because it had been expressly prescribed to him. Other modes, if practiced by other persons, might be equally acceptable. His deportment to others was full of charity and mildness. A sadness perpetually overspread his features, but was unmingled with sternness or discontent. The tones of his voice, his gestures, his steps, were all in tranquil unison. His conduct was characterized by a certain forbearance and humility, which secured the esteem of those to whom his tenets were the most obnoxious. They might call him a fanatic and a dreamer, but they could not deny their veneration to his invincible candor and invariable integrity. His own belief of rectitude was the foundation of his happiness. This, however, was destined to find an end. Suddenly, the sadness that constantly attended him was deepened. Sighs and even tears sometimes escaped him. To the expostulations of his wife, he seldom answered anything. When he designed to be communicative, he hinted that his peace of mind was flown, in consequence of deviation from his duty. A command had been laid upon him, which he had delayed to perform. He felt as if a certain period of hesitation and reluctance had been allowed him, but that this period was past. He was no longer permitted to obey. The duty assigned to him was transferred, in consequence of his disobedience, to another, and that all that remained was to endure the penalty. He did not describe this penalty. It appeared to be nothing more for some time than a sense of wrong. This was sufficiently acute, and was aggravated by the belief that his offense was incapable of expiation. No one could contemplate the agonies which he seemed to suffer without the deepest compassion. Time, instead of lightening the burden, appeared to add to it. At length, he hinted to his wife that his end was near. His imagination did not prefigure the mode or time of his decease, but was fraught with an incurable persuasion that his death was at hand. He was likewise haunted by the belief that the kind of death that awaited him was strange and terrible. His anticipations were thus far vague and indefinite, but they sufficed to poison every moment of his being, and devote him to ceaseless anguish. Chapter 2. Early in the morning of a sultry day in August, he left Mettingen to go to the city. He had seldom passed a day from home since his return from the shores of the Ohio. Some urgent engagements at this time existed, which would not admit of further delay. He returned in the evening, but appeared to be greatly oppressed with fatigue. His silence and dejection were likewise in a more than ordinary degree conspicuous. My mother's brother, whose profession was that of a surgeon, chanced to spend this night at our house. It was from him that I have frequently received an exact account of the mournful catastrophe that followed. As the evening advanced, my father's inquietudes increased. He sat with his family as usual, but took no part in their conversation. He appeared fully engrossed by his own reflections. Occasionally his countenance exhibited tokens of alarm. He gazed steadfastly and wildly at the ceiling, and the exertions of his companions were scarcely sufficient to interrupt his reverie. On recovering from these fits, he expressed no surprise, but pressing his hand to his head, complained, in a tremulous and terrified tone, that his brain was scorched to cinders. He would then betray marks of insupportable anxiety. My uncle perceived by his pulse that he was indisposed, but in no alarming degree, and ascribed appearances chiefly to the workings of his mind. He exhorted him to recollection and composure, but in vain. At the hour of repose, he readily retired to his chamber. At the persuasion of my mother, he even undressed and went to bed. Nothing could abate his restlessness. He checked her tender expostulations with some sternness. "Be silent," said he, For that which I feel there is but one cure, and that will shortly come. You can help me nothing. Look to your own condition, and pray to God to strengthen you under the calamities that await you." "What am I to fear?" she answered. "What terrible disaster is it that you think of?" "Peace. As yet I know not myself, but come it will, and shortly." She repeated her inquiries and doubts, but he suddenly put an end to the discourse by a stern command to be silent. She had never before known him to be in this mood. Hitherto all was benign in his deportment. Her heart was pierced with sorrow at the contemplation of this change. She was utterly unable to account for it, or to figure to herself the species of disaster that was menaced. Contrary to custom, the lamp, instead of being placed on the hearth, was left upon the table. Over it, and against the wall, there hung a small clock, so contrived as to strike a very hard stroke at the end of every 6th hour. That which was now approaching was a signal for retiring to the fane at which he addressed his devotions. Long habit had occasioned him to always awake at this hour, and the toll was instantly obeyed. Now frequent and anxious glances were cast at the clock. Not a single movement of the index appeared to escape his notice. As the hour verged towards 12, his anxiety visibly augmented. The trepidations of my mother kept pace with those of her husband, but she was intimidated into silence. All that was left to her was to watch every change of his features, and give vent to her sympathy in tears. At length the hour was spent, and the clock tolled. The sound appeared to communicate a shock to every part of my father's frame. He rose immediately, and threw over himself a loose gown. Even this office was performed with difficulty, for his joints trembled, and his teeth chattered with dismay. At this hour his duty called him to the rock, and my mother naturally concluded that it was thither he intended to repair. Yet these incidents were so uncommon as to fill her with astonishment and foreboding. She saw him leave the room, and heard his steps as they hastily descended the stairs. She had half resolved to rise and pursue him, but the wildness of the scheme quickly suggested itself. He was going to a place whither no power on earth could induce him to suffer an attendant. The window of her chamber looked toward the rock. The atmosphere was clear and calm, but the edifice could not be discovered at that distance through the dusk. My mother's anxiety would not allow her to remain where she was. She rose and seated herself at the window. She strained her sight to get a view of the dome and of the path that led to it. The first painted itself with sufficient distinctness on her fancy, but was undistinguishable by the eye from the rocky mass on which it was erected. The second could be imperfectly seen, but her husband had already passed, or had taken a different direction. What was it that she feared? Some disaster impended over her husband or herself. He had predicted evils, but professed himself ignorant of what nature they were. When were they to come? Was this night or this hour to witness the accomplishment? She was tortured with impatience and uncertainty. All her fears were at present linked to his person, and she gazed at the clock with nearly as much eagerness as my father had done in expectation of the next hour. And half an hour passed away in this state of suspense. Her eyes were fixed upon the rock. Suddenly, it was illuminated. A light proceeding from the edifice made every part of the scene visible. A gleam diffused itself over the intermediate space, and instantly a loud report, like the explosion of a mine, followed. She uttered an involuntary shriek, but the new sounds that greeted her ear quickly conquered her surprise. They were piercing shrieks, and uttered without intermission. The gleams which had diffused themselves far and wide were in a moment withdrawn, but the interior of the edifice was filled with rays. The first suggestion was that a pistol was discharged, and that the structure was on fire. She did not allow herself time to meditate a second thought, but rushed into the entry and knocked loudly at the door of her brother's chamber. My uncle had been previously roused by the noise, and instantly flew to the window. He also imagined what he saw to be fire. The loud and vehement shrieks which succeeded the first explosion seemed to be an invocation of succor. The incident was inexplicable, but he could not fail to perceive the propriety of hastening to the spot. He was unbolting the door when his sister's voice was heard on the outside, conjuring him to come forth. He obeyed the summons with all the speed in his power. He stopped not to question her, but hurried downstairs and across the meadow which lay between the house and the rock. The shrieks were no longer to be heard, but a blazing light was clearly discernible between the columns of the temple. Irregular steps, hewn in the stone, led him to the summit. On 3 sides, this edifice touched the very verge of the cliff. On the 4th side, which might be regarded as the front, there was an area of small extent, to which the rude staircase conducted you. My uncle speedily gained this spot. His strength was for a moment exhausted by his haste. He paused to rest himself. Meanwhile, he bent the most vigilant attention towards the object before him. Within the columns he beheld what he could no better describe than by saying that it resembled a cloud impregnated with light. It had the brightness of flame, but was without its upward motion. It did not occupy the whole area, and rose but a few feet above the floor. No part of the building was on fire. This appearance was astonishing. He approached the temple. As he went forward, the light retired, and when he put his feet within the apartment, utterly vanished. The suddenness of this transition increased the darkness that succeeded in a 10-fold degree. Fear and wonder rendered him powerless. An occurrence like this, in a place assigned to devotion, was adapted to intimidate the stoutest heart. His wandering thoughts were recalled by the groans of one near him. His sight gradually recovered its power, and he was able to discern my father stretched on the floor. At that moment, my mother and servants arrived with a lanthorn, and enabled my uncle to examine more closely this scene. My father, when he left the house, besides a loose upper vest and slippers, wore shirt and drawers. Now he was naked. His skin throughout the greater part of his body was scorched and bruised. His right arm exhibited marks as of having been struck by some heavy body. His clothes had been removed, and it was not immediately perceived that they were reduced to ashes. His slippers and hair were untouched. He was removed to his chamber, and the requisite attention paid to his wounds, which gradually became more painful. A mortification speedily showed itself in the arm, which had been most hurt. Soon after, the other wounded parts exhibited the like appearance. Immediately subsequent to this disaster, my father seemed nearly in a state of insensibility. He was passive under every operation. He scarcely opened his eyes, and was with difficulty prevailed upon to answer the questions that were put to him. By his imperfect account, it appeared that, while engaged in silent orisons, with thoughts full of confusion and anxiety, a faint gleam suddenly shot athwart the apartment. His fancy immediately pictured to itself a person bearing a lamp. It seemed to come from behind. He was in the act of turning to examine the visitant, when his right arm received a blow from a heavy club. At the same instant, a very bright spark was seen to light upon his clothes. In a moment, the whole was reduced to ashes. This was the sum of the information which he chose to give. There was somewhat in his manner that indicated an imperfect tale. My uncle was inclined to believe that half the truth had been suppressed. Meanwhile, the disease thus wonderfully generated betrayed more terrible symptoms. Fever and delirium terminated in lethargic slumber, which, in the course of 2 hours, gave place to death. Yet not till insupportable exhalations and crawling putrefaction had driven from his chamber and the house everyone whom their duty did not detain. Such was the end of my father. None surely was ever more mysterious. When we recollect his gloomy anticipations and unconquerable anxiety, the security from human malice which his character, the place, and the condition of the times might be supposed to confer, the purity and cloudlessness of the atmosphere which rendered the impossible that lightning was the cause, what are the conclusions that we must form? The prelusive gleam, the blow upon his arm, the fatal spark, the explosion heard so far, the fiery cloud that environed him without detriment to the structure, though composed of combustible materials, the sudden vanishing of this cloud at my uncle's approach. What is the inference to be drawn from these facts? Their truth cannot be doubted. My uncle's testimony is peculiarly worthy of credit because no man's temper is more skeptical, and his belief is unalterably attached to natural causes. I was at this time a child of 6 years of age. The impressions that were made then upon me can never be effaced. I was ill qualified to judge respecting what was then passing, but as I advanced in age and became more fully acquainted with these facts, they oftener became the subject of my thoughts. Their resemblance to recent events revived them with new force in my memory, and made me more anxious to explain them. Was this the penalty of disobedience? This the stroke of a vindictive and invisible hand? Is it fresh proof that the divine ruler interferes in human affairs, mediates an end, selects and commissions his agents, and enforces, by unequivocal sanctions, submission to his will? Or was it merely the irregular expansion of the fluid that imparts warmth to our heart and our blood, caused by the fatigue of the preceding day, or flowing by established laws from the condition of his thoughts? Chapter 3. The shock which this disastrous occurrence occasioned to my mother was the foundation of a disease which carried her, in a few months, to the grave. My brother and myself were children at this time, and were now reduced to the condition of orphans. The property which our parents left was by no means inconsiderable. It was entrusted to faithful hands till we should arrive at a suitable age. Meanwhile, our education was assigned to a maiden aunt who resided in the city, and whose tenderness made us in a short time cease to regret that we had lost a mother. The years that succeeded were tranquil and happy. Our lives were molested by few of those cares that are incident to childhood. By accident, more than design, the indulgence and yielding temper of our aunt was mingled with resolution and steadfastness. She seldom deviated into either extreme of rigor or lenity. Our social pleasures were subject to no unreasonable restraints. We were instructed in most branches of useful knowledge, and were saved from the corruption and tyranny of colleges and boarding schools. Our companions were chiefly selected from the children of our neighbors. Between one of these and my brother, there quickly grew the most affectionate intimacy. Her name was Catherine Pleyel. She was rich, beautiful, and contrived to blend the most bewitching softness with the most exuberant vivacity. The tie by which my brother and she were united seemed to add force to the love which I bore her, and which was amply returned. Between her and myself there was every circumstance tending to produce and foster friendship. Our sex and age were the same. We lived within sight of each other's abode. Our tempers were remarkably congenial, and the superintendence of our education not only prescribed to us the same pursuits, but allowed us to cultivate them together. Every day added strength to the triple bonds that united us. We gradually withdrew ourselves from the society of others, and found every moment irksome that was not devoted to each other. My brother's advance in age made no change in our situation. It was determined that his profession should be agriculture. His fortune exempted him from the necessity of personal labor. The task to be performed by him was nothing more than superintendence. The skill that was demanded by this was merely theoretical, and was furnished by casual inspection or by closet study. The attention that was paid to this subject did not seclude him for any long time from us, on whom time had no other effect than to augment our impatience in the absence of each other and of him. Our tasks, our walks, our music, were seldom performed but in each other's company. It was easy to see that Catherine and my brother were born for each other. The passion which they mutually entertained quickly broke those bounds which extreme youth had set to it. Confessions were made or extorted, and their union was postponed only till my brother had passed his minority. The previous lapse of 2 years was constantly and usefully employed. Oh, my brother! But the task I have set myself let me perform with steadiness. The felicity of that period was marred by no gloomy anticipations. The future, like the present, was serene. Time was supposed to have only new delights in store. I mean not to dwell on previous incidents longer than is necessary to illustrate or explain the great events that have since happened. The nuptial day at length arrived. My brother took possession of the house in which he was born, and here the long and protracted marriage was solemnized. My father's property was equally divided between us. A neat dwelling situated on the bank of the river, 3/4 of a mile from my brother's, was now occupied by me. These domains were called, from the name of the first possessor, Mettingen. I can scarcely account for my refusing to take up my abode with him, unless it were from a disposition to be an economist of pleasure. Self-denial, seasonably exercised, is one means of enhancing our gratifications. I was, beside, desirous of administering a fund and regulating a household of my own. The short distance allowed us to exchange visits as often as we pleased. The walk from one mansion to the other was no undelightful prelude to our interviews. I was sometimes their visitant, and they, as frequently, were my guests. Our education had been modeled by no religious standard. We were left to the guidance of our own understanding and the casual impressions which society might make upon us. My friend's temper, as well as my own, exempted us from much anxiety on this account. It must not be supposed that we were without religion, but with us it was the product of lively feelings, excited by reflection on our own happiness and by the grandeur of external nature. We sought not a basis for our faith, in the weighing of proofs and the dissection of creeds. Our devotion was a mixed and casual sentiment, seldom verbally expressed or solicitously sought or carefully retained. In the midst of present enjoyment, no thought was bestowed on the future. As a consolation in calamity, religion is dear, but calamity was yet at a distance, and its only tendency was to heighten enjoyments which needed not this addition to satisfy every craving. My brother's situation was somewhat different. His deportment was grave, considerate, and thoughtful. I will not say whether he was indebted to sublimer views for this disposition. Human life, in his opinion, was made up of changeable elements, and the principles of duty were not easily unfolded. The future, either as anterior or subsequent to death, was a scene that required some preparation and provision to be made for it. These positions we could not deny, but what distinguished him was a propensity to ruminate on these truths. The images that visited us were blithesome and gay, but those with which he was most familiar was of an opposite hue. They did not generate affliction and fear, but they diffused over his behavior a certain air of forethought and sobriety. The principal effect of this temper was visible in his features and tones. These in general bespoke of a sort of thrilling melancholy. I scarcely ever knew him to laugh. He never accompanied the lawless mirth of his companions with more than a smile, but his conduct was the same as ours. He partook of our occupations and amusements with a zeal not less than ours, but of a different kind. The diversity in our temper was never the parent of discord, and was scarcely a topic of regret. The scene was variegated, but not tarnished or disordered by it. It hindered the element in which we moved from stagnating. Some agitation and concussion is requisite to the due exercise of human understanding. In his studies, he pursued an austerer and more arduous path. He was much conversant with the history of religious opinions, and took pains to ascertain their validity. He deemed it indispensable to examine the ground of his belief, to settle the relation between motives and actions, the criterion of merit, and the kinds and properties of evidence. There was an obvious resemblance between him and my father, in their conceptions of the importance of certain topics, and in the light of which the vicissitudes of human life were accustomed to be viewed. Their characters were similar, but in the mind of the son was enriched by science, and embellished with literature. The temple was no longer assigned to its ancient use. From an Italian adventurer, who erroneously imagined that he could find employment for his skill and sale for his sculptures in America, my brother had purchased a bust of Cicero. He professed to have copied this piece from an antique dug up with his own hands in the environs of Modena. Of the truth of his assertions we were not qualified to judge, but the marble was pure and polished, and we were contented to admire the performance, without waiting for the sanction of connoisseurs. We hired the same artist to hew a suitable pedestal from a neighboring quarry. This was placed in the temple, and the bust rested upon it. Opposite to this was a harpsichord, sheltered by a temporary roof from the weather. This was the place of resort in the evenings of summer. Here we sung and talked and read and occasionally banqueted. Every joyous and tender scene most dear to my memory is connected with this edifice. Here the performances of our musical and poetical ancestor were rehearsed. Here my brother's children received the rudiments of their education. Here 1,000 conversations, pregnant with delight and improvement, took place. And here the social affections were accustomed to expand, and the tear of delicious sympathy to be shed. My brother was an indefatigable student. The authors whom he read were numerous, but the chief object of his veneration was Cicero. He never tired of conning and rehearsing his productions. To understand them was not sufficient. He was anxious to discover the gestures and cadences with which they ought to be delivered. He was very scrupulous in selecting a true scheme of pronunciation for the Latin tongue, and in adapting it to the words of his darling writer. His favorite occupation consisted in embellishing his rhetoric with all the proprieties of gesticulation and utterance. Not contented with this, he was diligent in settling and restoring the purity of the text. For this end, he collected all the editions and commentaries that could be procured, and employed months of severe study in exploring and comparing them. He never betrayed more satisfaction than when he made a discovery of this kind. It was not till the addition of Henry Pleyel, my friend's only brother, to our society, that his passion for Roman eloquence was countenanced and fostered by a sympathy of tastes. This young man had been some years in Europe. We had separated at a very early age, and he was now returned to spend the remainder of his days among us. Our circle was greatly enlivened by the accession of a new member. His conversation abounded with novelty. His gaiety was almost boisterous, but was capable of yielding to a grave deportment when the occasion required it. His discernment was acute, but he was prone to view every object merely as supplying materials for mirth. His conceptions were ardent, but ludicrous, and his memory, aided, as he honestly acknowledged, by his invention, was an inexhaustible fund of entertainment. His residence was at the same distance below the city as ours was above, but there seldom passed a day without our being favored with a visit. My brother and he were endowed with the same attachment to the Latin writers, and Pleyel was not behind his friend in his knowledge of the history and metaphysics of religion. Their creeds, however, were in many respects opposite. Where one discovered only confirmations of his faith, the other could find nothing but reasons for doubt. Moral necessity and Calvinistic inspiration were the props on which my brother thought proper to repose. Pleyel was the champion of intellectual liberty, and rejected all guidance but that of his reason. Their discussions were frequent, but being managed with candor as well as with skill, they were always listened to by us with avidity and benefit. Pleyel, like his new friends, was fond of music and poetry. Henceforth our concerts consisted of 2 violins, a harpsichord, and 3 voices. We are frequently reminded how much happiness depends on society. This new friend, though, before his arrival we were sensible of no vacuity, could now not be spared. His departure would occasion a void which nothing could fill, and which would produce insupportable regret. Even my brother, though his opinions were hourly assailed, and even the divinity of Cicero contested, was captivated with his friend, and laid aside some part of his ancient gravity at Pleyel's approach.
Chapter 4. 6 years of uninterrupted happiness had rolled away since my brother's marriage. The sound of war had been heard, but it was at such a distance as to enhance our enjoyment by affording objects of comparison. The Indians were repulsed on the side, and Canada was conquered on the other. Revolutions and battles, however calamitous to those who occupied the scene, contributed in some sort to our happiness by agitating our minds with curiosity and furnishing causes of patriotic exultation. 4 children, 3 of whom were in age to compensate, by their personal and mental progress, the cares of which they had been, at a more helpless age, the objects exercised by my brother's tenderness. The 4th was a charming babe that promised to display the image of her mother, and enjoyed perfect health. To these were added a sweet girl 14 years old who was loved by all of us, with an affection more than parental. Her mother's story was a mournful one. She had come hither from England when this child was an infant, alone, without friends, and without money. She had appeared to have embarked in a hasty and clandestine manner. She passed 3 years of solitude and anguish under my aunt's protection, and died a martyr to woe, the source of which she could by no importunities be prevailed upon to unfold. Her education and manners bespoke her to be of no mere birth. Her last moments were rendered serene by the assurances she received from my aunt that her daughter should experience the same protection that had been extended to herself. On my brother's marriage, it was agreed that she should make a part of his family. I cannot do justice to the attractions of this girl. Perhaps the tenderness she excited might be partly originate in her personal resemblance to her mother, whose character and misfortunes were still fresh in our remembrance. She was habitually pensive, and this circumstance tended to remind the spectator of her friendless condition. And yet that epithet was surely misapplied in this case. This being was cherished by those with whom she now resided, with unspeakable fondness. Every exertion was made to enlarge and improve her mind. Her safety was the object of a solicitude that almost exceeded the bounds of discretion. Our affection, indeed, could scarcely transcend her merits. She never met my eye or occurred to my reflections without exciting a kind of enthusiasm. Her softness, her intelligence, her equanimity never shall I see surpassed. I have often shed tears of pleasure at her approach and pressed her to my bosom in an agony of fondness. While every day was adding to the charms of her person and the stores of her mind, there occurred an event which threatened to deprive us of her. An officer of some rank, who had been disabled by a wound at Quebec, had employed himself, since the ratification of peace, in traveling through the colonies. He remained a considerable period at Philadelphia, but was at last preparing for his departure. No one had been more frequently honored with his visits than Mrs. Banton, a worthy lady with whom our family were intimate. He went to her house with a view to perform a farewell visit, and was on the point of taking his leave when I and my young friend entered the apartment. It is impossible to describe the emotions of the stranger when he fixed his eye upon my companion. He was motionless with surprise. He was unable to conceal his feelings, but sat silently gazing at the spectacle before him. At length he turned to Mrs. Banton, and more by his looks and gestures than by words, he besought her for an explanation of the scene. He seized the hand of the girl, who, in her turn, was surprised by his behavior, and drawing her forward, said in an eager and faltering tone, "Who is she? And whence does she come? What is her name?" The answers that were given only increased the confusion of his thoughts. He was successively told that she was the daughter of one whose name was Louisa Conway, who arrived among us at such a time, who seditiously concealed her parentage and the motives of her flight, whose incurable griefs had finally destroyed her, and who had left this child under the protection of her friends. Having heard the tale, he melted into tears, eagerly clasped the young lady in his arms, and called himself her father. When the tumults excited by his breast by this unlooked-for meeting were somewhat subsided, he gratified our curiosity by relating the following incidents. Miss Conway was the only daughter of a banker in London who discharged towards her every duty of an affectionate father. He had chanced to fall into her company, had been subdued by her attractions, had tendered her his hand, and been joyfully accepted both by parent and child. His wife had given him every proof of the fondest attachment. Her father, who possessed immense wealth, treated him with distinguished respect, liberally supplied his wants, and made one condition of his consent to their union, a resolution to take up their abode with him. They had passed 3 years of conjugal felicity, which had been augmented by the birth of this child, when his professional duty called him into Germany. It was not without an arduous struggle that she was persuaded to relinquish the design of accompanying him through all the toils and perils of war. No parting was ever more distressful. They strove to alleviate by frequent letters the evils of their lot. Those of his wife breathed nothing but anxiety for his safety and impatience of his absence. At length a new arrangement was made, and he was obliged to repair from Westphalia to Canada. One advantage attended this change. It accorded him an opportunity of meeting his family. His wife anticipated this interview with no less rapture than himself. He hurried to London, and at the moment he alighted from the stagecoach, ran with all speed to Mr. Conway's house. It was a house of mourning. His father was overwhelmed with grief and incapable of answering his inquiries. The servants, sorrowful and mute, were equally refractory. He explored the house and called on the names of his wife and daughter, but his summons was fruitless. At length, this new disaster was explained. 2 days before his arrival, his wife's chamber was found empty. No search, however diligent and anxious, could trace her steps. No cause could be assigned for her disappearance. The mother and child had fled away together. New exertions were made. Her chamber and cabinets were ransacked, but no vestige was found serving to inform them of the motives of her flight, whether it had been voluntary or otherwise, and in what corner of the kingdom or of the world she was concealed. Who shall describe the sorrow and amazement of the husband, his restlessness, his vicissitudes of hope and fear, and his ultimate despair? His duty called him to America. He had been in this city, and had frequently passed the door of the house in which his wife at that moment resided. Her father had not remitted his exertions to elucidate his painful mystery, but they had failed. This disappointment hastened his death, in consequence of which Louisa's father became professor of immense property. This tale was a copious theme of speculation. 1,000 questions were started and discussed in our domestic circle respecting the motives that influenced Mrs. Stuart to abandon her country. It did not appear that her proceeding was involuntary. We recalled and reviewed every particular that had fallen under our own observation. By none of these were we furnished with a clue. Her conduct, after the most rigorous scrutiny, still remained an impenetrable secret. On nearer view, Major Stuart proved himself a man of most amiable character. His attachment to Louisa appeared hourly to increase. She was no stranger to the sentiments suitable to her new character. She could not but readily embrace the scheme which was proposed to her, to return with her father to England. This scheme his regard for her induced him, however, to postpone. Some time was necessary to prepare her for so great a change and enable her to think without agony of her separation from us. I was not without hopes of prevailing on her father entirely to relinquish his unwelcome design. Meanwhile, he pursued his travels through the southern colonies, and his daughter continued with us. Louisa and my brother frequently received letters from him, which indicated a mind of no common order. They were filled with amusing details and profound reflections. While here, he often partook of our evening conversations at the table, and since his departure, his correspondence had frequently supplied us with topics of discourse. One afternoon in May, the blandness of the air and the brightness of the verdure induced us to assemble earlier than usual in the temple. We females were busy at the needle, while my brother and Pleyel were bandying quotations and syllogisms. The point discussed was the merit of the oration for Cleanthes, a descriptive, first, of the genius of the speaker, and secondly, of the manners of the times. Pleyel labored to extenuate both these species of merit, and tasked his ingenuity to shew that the orator had embraced a bad cause, or at least a doubtful one. He urged that to rely on the exaggerations of an advocate, or to make the picture of a single family a model from which to sketch the condition of a nation, was absurd. The controversy was suddenly diverted into a new channel by a misquotation. Pleyel accused his companion of saying policiator, when he should have said policricrator. Nothing would decide the contest but an appeal to the volume. My brother was returning to the house for this purpose, when a servant met him with a letter from Major Stuart. He immediately returned to read it in our company. Besides affectionate compliments to us and paternal benedictions on Louisa, his letter contained a description of a waterfall on the Monongahela. A sudden gust of rain falling, we were compelled to remove to the house. The storm passed away, and a radiant moonlight succeeded. There was no motion to resume our seats in the temple. We therefore remained where we were, and engaged in sprightly conversation. The letter lately received naturally suggested a topic. A parallel was drawn between the cataract there described, and one which Pleyel had discovered among the Alps of Galrus. In the state of the former, some particular was mentioned, the truth of which was questionable. To settle the dispute which thence arose, it was proposed to have recourse to the letter. My brother searched for it in his pocket. It was nowhere to be found. At length, he remembered to have left it in the temple and determined to go in search of it. His wife, Pleyel, Louisa, and myself remained where we were. In a few minutes he returned. I was somewhat interested in the dispute and was therefore impatient for his return, yet as I heard him ascending the stairs, I could not but remark that he had executed his intention with remarkable dispatch. My eyes were fixed upon him on his entrance. Methought he brought with him looks considerably different from those which he had departed. Wonder and a slight portion of anxiety were mingled in them. His eyes seemed to be in search of some object. They passed quickly from one person to the other till they rested on his wife. She was seated in a careless attitude on the sofa in the same spot as before. She had the same muslin in her hand, by which her attention was chiefly engrossed. The moment he saw her, his perplexity visibly increased. He quietly seated himself, and fixing his eyes on the floor, appeared to be absorbed in meditation. These singularities suspended the inquiry which I was preparing to make respecting the letter. In a short time, the company relinquished the subject which engaged them and directed their attention to Wieland. They thought that he only waited for a pause in the discourse to produce the letter. The pause was uninterrupted by him. At length, Pleyel said, "Well, I suppose you have found the letter?" "No," he said, without any abatement of his gravity, and looked steadfastly at his wife. "I did not mount the hill." "Why not?" "Catherine, have you not moved from that spot since I left the room?" She was affected with the solemnity of his manner, and laying down her work, answered in a tone of surprise, "No. Why do you ask that question?" His eyes were again fixed upon the floor, and he did not immediately answer. At length he said, looking round upon us, "Is it true that Catherine did not follow me to the hill? That she did not, just now, enter the room?" We assured him, with one voice, that she had not been absent for a moment, and inquired to the motive of his questions. "Your assurances," said he, "are solemn and unanimous, and yet I must deny credit to your assertions or disbelieve the testimony of my senses, which informed me, when I was halfway up the hill, that Catherine was at the bottom." We were confounded at his declaration. Pleyel rallied him with great levity on his behavior. He listened to his friend with calmness, but without any relaxation of features. "One thing," he said with emphasis, "is true. Either I heard my wife's voice at the bottom of the hill, or I do not hear your voice at present." "Truly," returned Pleyel, "it is a sad dilemma to which you have reduced yourself. Certain it is, if our eyes can give us certainty, that your wife has been sitting in the spot during every moment of your absence. You have heard her voice, you say, upon the hill. In general, her voice, like her temper, is all softness. To be heard across the room, she is obliged to exert herself. While you were gone, if I mistake not, she did not utter a word. Clara and I had all the talk to ourselves. Still, it may be that she held a whispering conference with you on the hill. But tell us the particulars." "The conference," said he, "was short, and far from being carried on in a whisper. You know with what intention I left the house. Halfway to the rock, the moon was for a moment hidden from us by a cloud. I never knew the air to be more bland and more calm. In this interval I glanced at the temple and thought I saw a glimmering between the columns. It was so faint that it would not perhaps have been visible if the moon had not been shrouded. I looked again, but saw nothing. I never visit this building alone or at night without being reminded of the fate of my father. There was nothing wonderful in this appearance, yet it suggested something more than mere solitude and darkness in the same place would have done. I kept on my way. The images that haunted me were solemn, and I entertained an imperfect curiosity, but no fear as to the nature of this object. I ascended the hill a little more than halfway when a voice called me from behind. The accents were clear, distinct, powerful, and were uttered, as I fully believed, by my wife. Her voice is not so commonly loud. She has seldom occasion to exert it, but nevertheless I have sometimes heard her call with force and eagerness. If my ear was not deceived, it was her voice which I heard. "Stop! Go no further! There is danger in your path!" The suddenness and unexpectedness of this warning, the tone of alarm with which it was given, and, above all, the persuasion that it was my wife who spoke were enough to disconcert me and make me pause. I turned and listened to assure myself that I was not mistaken. The deepest silence succeeded. At length, I spoke in my turn. "Who calls? Is it you, Catherine?" I stopped, and presently received an answer. "Yes, it is I. Go not up. Return instantly. You are wanted at the house." Still, the voice was Catherine's, and still it proceeded from the foot of the stairs. What could I do? The warning was mysterious. To be uttered by Catherine at a place and on an occasion like these enhanced the mystery. I could do nothing but obey. Accordingly, I trod back my steps, expecting that she waited for me at the bottom of the hill. When I reached the bottom, no one was visible. The moonlight was once more universal and brilliant, and yet, as far as I could see, no human or moving figure was discernible. If she had returned to the house, she must have used wondrous expedition to have passed already beyond the reach of my eye. I exerted my voice, but in vain. To my repeated exclamations, no answer was returned. Ruminating on these incidents, I returned hither. There was no room to doubt that I had heard my wife's voice. Attending incidents were not easily explained, but you now assure me that nothing extraordinary has happened to urge my return, and that my wife has not moved from her seat. Such was my brother's narrative. It was heard by us with different emotions. Pleyel did not scruple to regard the whole as a deception of the senses. Perhaps a voice had been heard, but Wieland's imagination had misled him in supposing a resemblance to that of his wife, and giving such a signification to the sounds. According to his custom, he spoke what he thought. Sometimes he made it the theme of grave discussion, but more frequently treated it with ridicule. He did not believe that sober reasoning would convince his friend, and gaiety, he thought, was useful to take away the solemnities which, in a mind like Wieland's, an accident of this kind was calculated to produce. Pleyel proposed to go in search of the letter. He went, and speedily returned bearing it in his hand. He had found it open on the pedestal, and neither voice nor visage had risen to impede his design. Catherine was endowed with an uncommon portion of good sense, but her mind was accessible, on this quarter, to wonder and panic. That her voice should be thus inexplicably and unwarrantably assumed was a source of no small disquietude. She admitted the plausibility of the arguments by which Pleyel endeavored to prove that this was no more than an auricular deception. But this conviction was sure to be shaken when she turned her eyes upon her husband and perceived that Pleyel's logic was far from having produced the same effect upon him. As to myself, my attention was engaged by this occurrence. I could not fail to perceive a shadowy resemblance between it and my father's death. On the latter event I had frequently reflected. My reflections never conducted me to a certainty, but the doubts that existed were not of a tormenting kind. I could not deny that the event was miraculous, and yet I was invincibly averse to the method of solution. My wonder was excited by the inscrutableness of the cause, but my wonder was unmixed with sorrow or fear. It begat in me a thrilling and not unpleasing solemnity. Similar to these were the sensations produced by the recent adventure. But its effect upon my brother's imagination was of chief moment. All that was desirable was that it be regarded by him with indifference. The worst effect that could flow was not indeed very formidable. Yet I could not bear to think that his senses should be the victims of such delusion. It argued a diseased condition of his frame which might show itself hereafter in more dangerous symptoms. The will is the tool of the understanding, which must fashion its conclusions to the notices of sense. If the senses be depraved, it is impossible to calculate the evils that may flow from the consequent deductions of the understanding. I said, this man is of an ardent and melancholy character. Those ideas which in others are casual or obscure, which are entertained in moments of abstraction and solitude, and easily escape when the scene is changed, have obtained an immovable hold upon his mind. The conclusions which long habit has rendered familiar, and, in some sort, palpable to his intellect, are drawn from the deepest sources. All his actions and practical sentiments are linked with long and obtrusive deductions from the system of divine government and the laws of our intellectual constitution. He is, in some respects, an enthusiast, but is fortified by his belief by innumerable arguments and subtleties. His father's death was always regarded by him as flowing from a direct and supernatural decree. It visited his meditations oftener than it did mine. The traces which it left were more gloomy and permanent. This new incident had a visible effect in augmenting his gravity. He was less disposed than formerly to converse and read. When we sifted his thoughts, they were generally found to have a relation, more or less direct, with this incident. It was difficult to ascertain the exact species of impression which it made upon him. He never introduced the subject into conversation, and listened with a silent and half-serious smile to the satirical effusions of Pleyel. One evening, we chanced to be alone together in the temple. I seized that opportunity of investigating the state of his thoughts. After a pause, which he seemed in no wise inclined to interrupt, I spoke to him. How almost palpable is this dark, yet a ray from above would dispel it. Aye, said Wieland, with fervor, not only the physical, but the moral night would be dispelled. But why, said I, must the divine will address its precepts to the eye? He smiled significantly. True, said he, the understanding has other avenues. You have never, said I, approaching nearer the point, you have never told me in what way you considered the late extraordinary incident. There is no determinate way in which the subject can be viewed. Here is an effect, but the cause is utterly inscrutable. To suppose a deception will not do. Such is possible, but there are 20 other suppositions more probable. They must all be set aside before we reach that point. What are these 20 suppositions? It is needless to mention them. They are only less improbable than Pleyel's. Time may convert one of them into certainty. Till then, it is useless to expatiate on them. Chapter 5. Some time had elapsed when there happened another occurrence, still more remarkable. Pleyel, on his return from Europe, brought information of considerable importance to my brother. My ancestors were noble Saxons, and possessed large domains in Lusatia. The Prussian wars had destroyed those persons whose right to these estates precluded my brother's. Pleyel had been exact in his inquiries, and had discovered that, by the law of male primogeniture, my brother's claims were superior to those of any other person now living. Nothing was wanting but his presence in that country, and a legal application to establish this claim. Pleyel strenuously recommended this measure. The advantages, he thought, attending it were numerous, and it would argue the utmost folly to neglect them. Contrary to his expectation, he found my brother averse to the scheme. Slight efforts he, at first, thought would subdue his reluctance, but he found this aversion by no means slight. The interest that he took in the happiness of his friend and his sister, and his own partiality to the Saxon soil, from which he had likewise sprung, and where he had spent several years of his youth, made him redouble his exertions to win Wieland's consent. For this end, he employed every argument that his invention could suggest. He painted in attractive colors the state of manners and government in that country, the security of civil rights, and the freedom of religious sentiments. He dwelt on the privileges of wealth and rank, and drew from the servile condition of one class an argument in favor of this scheme, since the revenue and power annexed to a German principality affords so large a field for benevolence. The evil flowing from this power in malignant hands was proportioned to the good that would arise from the virtuous use of it. Hence, Wieland, in forbearing claims to his own, withheld all the positive felicity that would accrue to his vassals from his success, and hazarded all the misery that would redound from a less enlightened proprietor. It was easy for my brother to repel these arguments, and to show that no spot on the globe enjoyed equal security and liberty to that which he at present inhabited. If the Saxons had nothing to fear from his misgovernment, the external causes of havoc and alarm were numerous and manifest. The recent devastations committed by the Prussians furnished a specimen of these. The horrors of war would always impend over them till Germany were seized and divided by Austrian and Prussian tyrants, and which event he strongly suspected was at no great distance. But setting these contradictions aside, was it laudable to grasp at wealth and power even when they were within our reach? Were not these two great sources of depravity? What security had he that in his charge of place and condition he should not degenerate into a tyrant and voluptuary? Power and riches were chiefly to be dreaded on account of their tendency to deprave the possessor. He held them in abhorrence, not only as instruments of misery to others, but to him on whom they were conferred. Besides, riches were comparative, and was he not rich already? He lived at present in the bosom of security and luxury. All the instruments of pleasure, on which his reason or imagination set any value, were within his reach. But these he must forego, for the sake of advantages which, whatever were their value, were as yet uncertain. In pursuit of an imaginary addition to his wealth, he must reduce himself to poverty. He must exchange present certainties for what was distant and contingent. For who knows not that the law is a system of expense, delay, and uncertainty? If he should embrace this scheme, it would lay him under the necessity of making a voyage to Europe and remaining for a certain period separate from his family. He must undergo the perils and discomforts of the ocean. He must divest himself of all domestic pleasures. He must deprive his wife of her companion and his children of a father and instructor, for the ambiguous advantages which overgrown wealth and flagitious tyranny have to bestow, for a precarious possession in a land of turbulence and war, advantages which will not certainly be gained, and of which the acquisition, if it were sure, is necessarily distant. Pleyel was enamored of his scheme on account of its intrinsic benefits, but, likewise, for other reasons. His abode at Leipzig made that country appear to him like home. He was connected with this place by many social ties. While there, he had not escaped the amorous contagion. But the lady, though her heart was impressed in his favor, was compelled to bestow her hand upon another. Death had removed this impediment, and he was now invited by the lady herself to return. This he was of course determined to do, but was anxious to obtain the company of Wieland. He could not bear to think of an eternal separation from his present associates. Their interest, he thought, would be no less promoted by the change in his own. Hence, he was importunate and indefatigable in his arguments and solicitations. He knew that he could not hope for mine or his sister's ready concurrence in his scheme. Should this subject be mentioned to us, we should league our efforts against him and strengthen that reluctance in Wieland which already was sufficiently difficult to conquer. He, therefore, anxiously concealed from us his purpose. If Wieland were previously enlisted in his cause, he would find it a less difficult task to overcome our aversion. My brother was silent on this subject, because he believed himself in no danger of changing his opinion, and he was willing to save us from any uneasiness. The mere mention of such a scheme, and the possibility of his embracing it, he knew, would considerably impair our tranquillity. One day, about 3 weeks subsequent to the mysterious call, it was agreed that the family should be my guests. Seldom had a day been passed by us of more serene enjoyment. Pleyel had promised us his company, but we did not see him till the sun had nearly declined. He brought with him a countenance that betokened disappointment and vexation. He did not wait for our inquiries, but immediately explained the cause. 2 days before, a packet arrived from Hamburg, by which he had flattered himself with the expectation of receiving letters, but no letters had arrived. I never saw him so much subdued by an untoward event. His thoughts were employed in accounting for the silence of his friends. He was seized with the torments of jealousy, and suspected nothing less than the infidelity of her to whom he had devoted his heart. The silence must have been concerted. Her sickness, or absence, or death would have increased the certainty of someone's having written. No supposition could be formed but that his mistress had grown indifferent, or that she had transferred her affections to another. The miscarriage of a letter was hardly within the reach of possibility. From Leipzig to Hamburg, and from Hamburg hither, the conveyance was exposed to no hazard. He had been so long detained in America chiefly in consequence of Wieland's aversion to the scheme which he proposed. He now became more impatient than ever to return to Europe. When he reflected that, by his delays, he had probably forfeited the affections of his mistress, his sensations amounted to agony. It only remained, by his speedy departure, to repair, if possible, or prevent so intolerable an evil. Already he had half resolved to embark in his very ship which, he was informed, would set out in a few weeks on her return. Meanwhile, he determined to make a new attempt to shake the resolution of Wieland. The evening was somewhat advanced when he invited the latter to walk abroad with him. The invitation was accepted, and they left Catherine, Louisa, and me to amuse ourselves by the best means in our power. During this walk, Pleyel renewed the subject that was nearest his heart. He re-urged all his former arguments and placed them in a more forcible light. They promised to return shortly, but hour after hour passed, and they made not their appearance. Engaged in sprightly conversation, it was not till the clock struck 12 that we were reminded of the lapse of time. The absence of our friends excited some uneasy apprehensions. We were expressing our fears and comparing our conjectures as to what might be the case when they entered together. There were indications in their countenances that struck me mute. These were unnoticed by Catherine, who was eager to express her surprise and curiosity at the length of their walk. As they listened to her, I remarked that their surprise was not less than ours. They gazed in silence on each other and on her. I watched their looks, but could not understand the emotions that were written in them. These appearances diverted Catherine's inquiries into a new channel. What did they mean, she asked, by their silence, and by their thus gazing wildly at each other and at her? Pleyel profited by this hint, and assuming an air of indifference, framed some trifling excuse, at the same time darting significant glances at Wieland, as if to caution him against disclosing the truth. My brother said nothing, but delivered himself up to meditation. I likewise was silent, but burned with impatience to fathom this mystery. Presently my brother and his wife and Louisa returned home. Pleyel proposed of his own accord to be my guest for the night. This circumstance, in addition to those which preceded, gave new edge to my wonder. As soon as we were left alone, Pleyel's countenance assumed an air of seriousness and even consternation, which I had never before beheld in him. The steps with which he measured the floor betokened the trouble of his thoughts. My inquiries were suspended by the hope that he would give me the information that I wanted, without the importunity of questions. I waited some time, but the confusion of his thoughts appeared in no degree to abate. At length, I mentioned the apprehensions which their unusual absence had occasioned, and which were increased by their behavior since their return, and solicited an explanation. He stopped when I began to speak, and looked steadfastly at me. When I had done, he said to me, in a tone which faltered through the vehemence of his emotions, "How were you employed during our absence?" "In turning over the Della Crusca dictionary and talking on different subjects. But just before your entrance, we were tormenting ourselves with omens and prognostics relative to your absence." "Catherine was with you the whole time?" "Yes." "But are you sure?" "Most sure. She was not absent a moment." He stood for a time, as if to assure himself of my sincerity. Then, clenching his hands and wildly lifting them above his head, "Lo," cried he, "I have news to tell you. The Baroness de Stolberg is dead." This was her whom he loved. I was not surprised at the agitations which he betrayed. But how was the information procured? How was the truth of this news connected with the circumstance of Catherine's remaining in our company? He was for some time inattentive to my questions. When he spoke, it seemed merely a continuation of the reverie into which he had been plunged. "And yet, it might be a mere deception. But could both of us in that case have been deceived? A rare and prodigious coincidence. Barely not impossible. And yet, if the accent be oracular, Teresa is dead. No, continued he, covering his face with his hands, and in a tone half broken into sobs. "I cannot believe it. She has not written. But if she were dead, the faithful Bertrand would have given me the earliest information, and yet if he knew his master, he must have easily guessed at the effect of such tidings. Oh, in pity to me, he was silent. Clara, forgive me. To you, this behavior is mysterious. I will explain as well as I am able, but say not a word to Catherine. Her strength of mind is inferior to yours. She will, besides, have more reason to be startled. She is Wieland's angel." Pleyel proceeded to inform me, for the first time, of the scheme which he had pressed so much with earnestness on my brother. He enumerated the objections which had been made and the industry with which he had endeavored to confute them. He mentioned the effect upon his resolutions produced by the failure of a letter. "During our late walk," continued he, "I introduced the subject that was nearest my heart. I re-urged all my former arguments and placed them in more forcible lights. Wieland was still refractory. He expatiated on the perils of wealth and power, on the sacredness of conjugal and parental duties, and the happiness of mediocrity. No wonder that the time passed unperceived away. Our whole souls were engaged in this cause. Several times we came to the foot of the rock. As soon as we perceived it, we changed our course, but never failed to terminate our circuitous and devious ramble at this spot. At length, your brother observed, 'We seem to be led hither by a kind of fatality, since we are so near. Let us ascend and rest ourselves a while. If you are not weary of this argument, we will resume it there.' I tacitly consented. We mounted the stairs, and drawing the sofa in front of the river, we seated ourselves upon it. I took up the thread of our discourse where we had dropped it. I ridiculed his dread of the sea and his attachment to home. I kept on this strain, so congenial with my disposition, for some time, uninterrupted by him. At length, he said to me, 'Suppose now that I, whom argument has not convinced, should yield to ridicule and should agree that your scheme is eligible. What will you have gained? Nothing. You have other enemies besides myself to encounter. When you have vanquished me, your toil has scarcely begun. There are my sister and wife with whom you will remain for you to maintain the contest. And trust me, they are adversaries whom all your force and stratagem will never subdue.' I insinuated that they would model themselves by his will, that Catherine would think obedience her duty. He answered with some quickness, 'You mistake. Their concurrence is indispensable. It is not my custom to exact sacrifices of this kind. I live to be their protector and friend, and not their tyrant and foe. If my wife shall deem her happiness and that of her children most consulted by remaining where she is, here she shall remain. But,' said I, 'when she knows your pleasure, will she not conform to it?' Before my friend had time to answer this question, a negative was clearly and distinctly uttered from another quarter. It did not come from one side or the other, from before us or behind. Whence then did it come? By whose organs was it fashioned? If any uncertainty had existed with regard to these particulars, it would have been removed by a deliberate and equally distinct repetition of the same monosyllable. 'No.' The voice was my sister's. It appeared to come from the roof. I started from my seat. 'Catherine,' exclaimed I, 'where are you?' No answer was returned. I searched the room and the area before it, but in vain. Your brother was motionless in his seat. I returned to him and placed myself again by his side. My astonishment was not less than his. 'Well,' said he at length, 'what think you of this? This is the self-same voice which I formerly heard. You are now convinced that my ears were well informed.' 'Yes,' said I, 'this, it is plain, is no fiction of the fancy.' We again sunk into mutual and thoughtful silence. A recollection of the hour and of the length of our absence made me at last propose to return. We rose up for this purpose. In doing this, my mind reverted to the contemplation of my own condition. 'Yes,' said I aloud, but without particularly addressing myself to Wieland, 'my resolution is taken. I cannot hope to prevail with my friends to accompany me. They may doze away their days on the banks of the Schuylkill, but as to me, I will go in the next vessel. I will fly to her presence and demand the reason of this extraordinary silence.' I scarcely finished the sentence when the same mysterious voice exclaimed, 'You shall not go. The seal of death is on her lips. Her silence is the silence of the tomb.' Think of the effects which accents like these must have had upon me. I shuddered as I listened. As soon as I recovered from my first amazement, 'Who is it that speaks?' said I. Whence did you procure these dismal tidings?" I did not wait long for an answer. "From a source that cannot fail. Be satisfied. She is dead." You may justly be surprised that in the circumstance in which I heard the tidings, and notwithstanding the mystery which environed him by whom they were imparted, I could give an undivided attention to the facts which were the subject of our dialogue. I eagerly inquired when and where did she die? What was the cause of her death? Was her death absolutely certain? An answer was returned only to the last of these questions. "Yes," was pronounced by the same voice, but it now sounded from a greater distance, and the deepest silence was all the return made to my subsequent interrogatories. It was my sister's voice, but it could not be uttered by her, and yet, if not by her, by whom was it uttered? When we returned hither, and discovered you together, the doubt that had previously existed was removed. It was manifest that the intimation came not from her. Yet if not from her, from whom could it come? Are the circumstances attending the imparting of this news proof that the tidings are true? God forbid that they should be true. Here Pleyel sunk into anxious silence, and gave me leisure to ruminate on this inexplicable event. I am at a loss to describe the sensations that affected me. I am not fearful of shadows. The tales of apparitions and enchantments did not possess that power over my belief which could even render them interesting. I saw nothing in them but ignorance and folly, and was a stranger even to that terror which is pleasing. But this incident was different from any that I had ever before known. Here were proofs of a sensible and intelligent existence which could not be denied. Here was information obtained and imparted by means unquestionably superhuman. That there are conscious beings besides ourselves in existence, whose modes of activity and information surpass our own, can scarcely be denied. Is there a glimpse afforded us into a world of these superior beings? My heart was scarcely large enough to give admittance to so swelling a thought. An awe, the sweetest and most solemn that imagination can conceive, pervaded my whole frame. It forsook me not when I parted from Pleyel and retired to my chamber. An impulse was given to my spirits utterly incompatible with sleep. I passed the night wakeful and full of meditation. I was impressed with the belief of mysterious, but not of malignant agency. Hitherto nothing had occurred to persuade me that this airy minister was busy to evil rather than to good purposes. On the contrary, the idea of superior virtue had always been associated in my mind with that of superior power. The warnings that had thus been heard appeared to have been prompted by beneficent intentions. My brother had been hindered by this voice from ascending the hill. He was told that danger lurked in his path, and his obedience to the intimation had perhaps saved him from a destiny similar to that of my father. Pleyel had been rescued from tormenting uncertainty, and from the hazards and fatigues of a fruitless voyage by the same interposition. It had assured him of the death of his Teresa. This woman was then dead. A confirmation of the tidings, if true, would speedily arrive. Was this confirmation to be deprecated or desired? By her death, the tie that attached him to Europe was taken away. Henceforward, every motive would combine to retain him in his native country, and we were rescued from the deep regrets that would accompany his hopeless absence from us. Propitious was the spirit that imparted these tidings. Propitious he would have been, perhaps, if he had been instrumental in producing as well as communicating the tidings of her death. Propitious to us, the friends of Pleyel, to whom has there been secured the enjoyment of his society, and not unpropitious to himself, for though this object of his love be snatched away, is there not another who is able and willing to console him for her loss? 20 days after this, another vessel arrived from the same port. In this interval, Pleyel, for the most part, estranged himself from his old companions. He was become the prey of a gloomy and unsociable grief. His walks were limited to the bank of the Delaware. This bank is an artificial one. Reeds in the river are on one side, and a watery marsh on the other, in that part which bounded his lands, which he extended from the mouth of Hollander's Creek to that of the Schuylkill. No scene can be imagined less enticing to a lover of the picturesque than this. The shores deformed with mud and encumbered with a forest of reeds. The fields in most seasons are mire, but when they afford a firm footing, the ditches by which they are bounded and intersected are mantled with stagnating green and emit the most noxious exhalations. Health is no less a stranger to these seats than pleasure. Spring and autumn are sure to be accompanied with the agues and bilious remittents. The scenes which environed our dwellings at Meneggin constituted the reverse of this. Schuylkill was here a pure and translucid current, broken into wild and ceaseless music by rocky points, murmuring on the sandy margin, and reflecting on its surface banks of all varieties of height and degrees of declivity. These banks were checkered by patches of dark verdure and shapeless masses of white marble, and crowned by copses of cedar or by the regular magnificence of orchards, which at this season were in blossom, and were prodigal of odors. The ground which receded from the river was scooped into valleys and dales. Its beauties were enhanced by the horticultural skill of my brother, who bedecked this exquisite assemblage of slopes and risings with every species of vegetable ornament, from the giant arms of the oak to the clustering tendrils of the honeysuckle. To screen him from the unwholesome airs of his own residence, it had been proposed to Pleyel to spend the months of spring with us. He had apparently acquiesced in this proposal, but the late event induced him to change his purpose. He was only to be seen by visiting him in his retirements. His gaiety had flown, and every passion was absorbed in eagerness to procure tidings from Saxony. I have mentioned the arrival of another vessel from the Elbe. He descried her early one morning as he was passing along the skirt of the river. She was easily recognized, being the ship in which he had performed his first voyage to Germany. He immediately went on board, but found no letters directed to him. This omission was, in some degree, compensated by meeting with an old acquaintance among the passengers, who had till lately been a resident in Leipzig. This person put an end to all suspense respecting the fate of Teresa by relating the particulars of her death and funeral. Thus was the truth of the former intimation attested. No longer devoured by suspense, the grief of Pleyel was not long in yielding to the influence of society. He gave himself up once more to our company. His vivacity had indeed been damped, but even in this respect he was a more acceptable companion than formerly, since his seriousness was neither incommunicative nor sullen. These incidents for a time occupied all our thoughts. In me they produced a sentiment not unallied to pleasure, and more speedily than in the case of my friends were intermixed with other topics. My brother was particularly affected by them. It was easy to perceive that most of his meditations were tinctured from this source. To this was to be ascribed a design in which his pen was, at this period, engaged of collecting and investigating the facts which relate to that mysterious personage, the demon of Socrates. My brother's skill in Greek and Roman learning was exceeded by that of few, and no doubt the world would have accepted a treatise upon this subject from his hand with avidity. But alas! This and every other scheme of felicity and honor were doomed to sudden blast and hopeless extermination. You have been listening to chapters 1 through 5 of Wieland, or The Transformation, an American tale by Charles Brockton Brown, brought to you by Classics You Slept Through.